Welcome in. Today, I have one of the co-authors of these two amazing books about the Bee Gees. They're very intensive, so bear with me because we've got a lot of coverage today. So let me welcome first Grant Walters.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You, along with Andrew Monhughes and Mark Crohan, worked on this double edition. First of all, before we get into the actual Bee Gees, a very famous and phenomenal group, can you tell me how you go about divvying up? What was your writing style? Because there's three of you, and there's three Bee Gees, obviously. But how did you go about doing that? The actual writing and getting down all the information you wanted to get out?
Yeah, it's a great question. A pretty intense process. So a little bit of background, Mark and Andrew actually wrote a biography about the Bee Gees about 20 years ago. It did very, very well. So they had a lot of background information already sort of in their coffers. But the three of us, have different parts of the Bee Gees careers that we really loved and that we have knowledge about. Andrew and Mark are really serious historians, and they're also really serious collectors as well. Andrew used to work on several projects for the Bee Gees, so he did several videos and TV specials and liner notes for albums. So he pretty well versed in their career throughout the years. Mark has been a fan since 1966, and so he had one of the largest collections of Bee Gees memorabilia in Australia, certainly, but probably everywhere. So the three of us arrived with different skill sets. And so part of what we agreed upon as we, sort of talked about these books was, first of all, building a timeline. And these books are a little bit different than a traditional biography because they cover the trajectory of their career chronologically. And so we were able to map everything out song by song, album by album. So we established a timeline, built the narrative around the albums and the songs that they produced, and then built a narrative in between. And so we sort of had a nice way of being able to map things out and having a really logical sequence of things that we could talk about. So that's what we did. It was built into a skeleton. We had information about each of their projects, and then we sort of fit in other events that fit that timeline around them. And as we discovered more information or found an interesting quote, or we talked to somebody that was associated with them, it became a little bit easier to fit in that information around that chronological timeline. So the format of the books was really nice in that respect, that we could really do that in a way that told the story very much from start to finish. And so we're about halfway through, so we're getting there, but there's a lot still more to cover.
Well, you know what? Reading actually in chronological order was wonderful because you could see the progression and the growth of the individuals themselves. But you not only cover the songs, you cover their personal lives. And what struck me, and I was talking to a friend of mine, and she knew this, I did not know this. Basically, when they were little kids, they were little hoodlums.
Yeah, they
could have ended up in juvenile detention.
They got into some mischief when they were younger, for sure. They were firebugs, or at least I think Barry and Robin were firebugs, at least. So they had a lot of freedom running around as kids, and so they got themselves into some trouble for sure. And it was gently suggested, and one of the reasons why they ended up moving to Australia when they were younger was to sort of keep them out of trouble and to give them more space to explore and walk around and run around and cause problems. So, but also I think, they're eventually, as they got more into their music and they started to develop into artists, I think that sort of gave them something to focus on. But yeah, they definitely, and admittedly, they admitted to this, that they, certainly got themselves into some trouble when they were younger. So that's definitely part of their younger years for sure.
Well, thank God for them that they found music, because that was their salvation. Another thing in the book that I really want you to delve on, because they just developed their harmonizing themselves without any outside interference or assistance. They just sat down in their bed and started singing together. Is that right?
That is what the story says, yes, for sure. And so their mom, Barbara, and their dad, Hugh, you know, depending on which one you asked previously, each one of them would say that they were the one that walked in and discovered them singing on the bed together. You know, certainly the house was filled with music. Dad was a big band leader in the 30s and 40s, and their mom was a singer as well. And that was sort of the guise of how their two parents met as well. They met during a session, during an event where they connected. So the house was full of music. The brothers early on listened to the Mills Brothers, listened to big band music. They were certainly early fans of the Everly Brothers and Elvis Presley, and you know, other acts that were particularly impactful at the time. And so they, you know, they were always surrounded by music. And so, but yeah, they came up with singing in harmony very naturally, and that's how the story goes. And you know, they were prodigious, and that was something about them that was really, really special. And so they started singing together when Robin and Morris were maybe 7 or 8 years old, and Barry was 9 or 10. And so that's how it progressed from there. But they've always had that very natural ability to key into each other's voices. They could always sound very similar, but always very distinctive at the same time. And that's something not every group could claim to have been able to do. So that was something that I don't doubt happened, but I'm sure that came from listening to the radio and listening to records, and probably emulating some of the sounds they heard early on. But eventually they came to use those harmonies in their own songs from a very, very early age.
Now, how and why was it an accident that Barry discovered his falsetto, his really high pitched voice? How did that come about?
Yeah, well, here's the thing. All men have the ability to sing in falsetto, whether or not you sound great doing that or you want to sound like that. All men have the ability in the register of their voice to be able to do that. And the reality is that, you know, the Bee Gees have pretty expansive voices. All of them could sing a tremendous amount of range of notes and textures and things. And so falsetto was always present in their music, even back to their earlier days, even their first international recordings that they made in the late 60s. You can hear elements of that falsetto in there. Where that came about, when they started using it sort of as a fixture in their music, was starting in about 1974, when they worked with legendary producer Arif Mardin, you know, a producer for Aretha Franklin and Hall & Oates and the Average White Band. And so when they started working with him in the middle of the 70s, they sort of began to unearth their passion for rhythm and blues music and soul music, which had always been there. But I think Arif did a very nice job of encouraging them to explore that more and to give them the permission, I think, to pursue that, because they'd been very well known for this sort of Baroque balladry that they had done for many years. So I think the falsetto initially, when it was sort of discovered, or at least unearthed to the point where they used it as a major feature, was on the song Nights on Broadway when they were recording the Main Course album in 1975. And the story goes is that Arif asked some or all the brothers at some point to sort of try this voice to add some texture on top of this song. And Barry hit the jackpot. And so that voice had always been there. But that was really when he started to use it. And moving forward, they really incorporated that as a main feature of their music. So it was a game changer for them for sure. And it defined their sound, not just for that song, but also moving forward for the next several years and for the rest of their careers too. So that was always, the falsetto always popped back around, no matter how.
Right, you said it defined a lot of their music. When you hear that, you know that's the Bee Gees. Now, let me ask you about Andy, who was, I don't know, about 14 years younger than Barry or something like that.
Yeah.
Was he had his solo career? Was it ever discussed, do you think, that he would join the trio, or was that just a no-show? Andy was younger, the baby. Goodbye, Andy. You're on your own.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of things figured into that. And of course, Andy started writing his own music when he was living in Australia when he was a teenager. And so a lot of the songs that you heard on his first album, Flowing Rivers, had been written when he was 15, 16 years old. So he, in his own right, was a really talented songwriter. He was a great singer. I think had Andy not pursued the invitation to come to America and record his first album with Barry and his producers, and to join the Robert Stigwood's RSO label, Andy would have probably continued to write and produce his own music, just because I think that was something he loved. He might have taken a different route, sonically. So there was that. I mean, he was an artist in his own right, and was really talented. The Bee Gees were a really well-established group by the time Andy, sort of started to pursue a really successful solo career. And so I think it might have been tough for Andy to join. There was apparently conversation. I don't think we'll ever know about what was exactly discussed between the brothers. They say that, at different points they, had considered having Andy join, and that just shortly before he passed away, the narrative is that that was part of the plan for their upcoming album, which eventually would be One, which was released in 1989. But of course, Andy unfortunately passed away before that happened. But I think while Andy was making music and was successful, I mean, he was at times more successful than his brothers on the charts in the late 70s. And so I think there was a lot of interest in sort of having him blossom on his own. But that was apparently part of the conversation, on several occasions. And then, of course, he had difficulties, right? He struggled with drug addiction and alcoholism, which I think made it tougher down the road for him to join the Bee Gees, who were, actively singing, songwriting, producing other artists into the 80s. And so I think that changed the conversation at some point too.
Well, in many ways, each of the three main the Bee Gees did have alcohol and drug problems throughout their lives. It wasn't just concentrated on Andy. They all sunk into that sick doldrum, that the depth that we know, what we hear about a lot of singers get into. But besides the drugs and alcohol, they had some tumultuous times together. They were together and they split up, and then one of them wanted to leave and one of them got together, and it was just like, why couldn't they just stay as the group? Was it personality conflict, or what was it that kept tearing them apart throughout the years?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, when the Bee Gees first started to become famous, and so that first wave of success they had in 1967, when they debuted internationally, and they got a recording contract with Robert Stigwood. I mean, they had already been singing together since 1958, 1959, and making recordings. So by that time, they had already been spending a lot of time writing and recording together, performing. And so you have to sort of think, what happens when all of a sudden, and their success was meteoric. I mean, they were actively working in Australian as musicians, recording as a recording act, as performers. And so by the time they eventually, hit it big, you have to think about what that sort of sudden success does to a group of young guys who, and really the Bee Gees story is really rags to riches. And so they started out with nothing. And they supported their family for the longest time, and then all of a sudden they had a lot of money, they had success, they had a lot of cachet. Other artists were recording their music and were really interested in them, and so you have to think about young people, sort of what influence that has on your career. And I think certainly egos come into play, and that eventually, along with drugs and alcohol, and a lot of things that I think plagued a lot of groups in that era, that were successful, that eventually broke them apart in 1969, and all of them eventually ended up abandoning the Bee Gees. And so at the start of 1970, the Bee Gees did not exist. And so when you think about that sort of pathway, it's very interesting to think about the 1970s, which is where our second book sort of chronicles their career, that they started from absolutely nothing to being, by the end of 1979, arguably one of the most successful groups on planet Earth. But I think there was always some tension between them. And you have to think about the three of them. They all had individual talents. Robin and Barry had magnificent voices. Morris had this innate musical sensibility that sort of was the glue that held everything together. And families are complicated, as if you're a part of a normal family. Families are are complicated. You have to think about what that means when you're a creative and a financial relationship with your family. Um, but I will say that I think the tension between them was important to their career. And I think that had they not had that sort of push and pull and some of those conflicts and the things that um, I think pushed them to be better and to explore and to challenge each other, I don't know that we probably see them being as creatively successful as they were. And so I think that tension and that sort of, if you want to call it sibling rivalry, for lack of a better term, I don't think that they would have been as creatively prolific as they were. So I do think, although it pushed them apart at times and caused issues, I think it was important to their sort of heart and soul as a group.
And you also write in there in one of in one of the editions that Morris was more of the calming force and helped. I don't know if the right word is allay some of the issues between the other brothers, but he was the glue in many ways. Is that a good way to describe him?
I think it really was. Morris was sort of an everyman, in all that sense. Morris could sing. He was the person that filled in, the spaces in between their harmonies as well, and knew just the right spot to hit. But as Morris grew as a musician, he eventually became their musical director, and so. Especially from the 80s moving forward, a lot of the influence that you hear in their music and their sonic quality was as a result of Morris's ability to experiment, explore new technology. So, creatively, and I think in terms of relationship between him and his brothers, I think, yeah, he was the quelling force between Barry and Robin, who both had, were strong egos and who had a lot of creative sort of opinions about things. And even when they did solo work, Morris bounced back and forth between different projects and, was supportive of his brothers as well. But it was one of the reasons why I think the Bee Gees weren't able to carry on without him when he passed in 2003 was that I think they were missing that really important agreement, that sort of ingredient in their harmony, both in their vocals and also in their relationship as a band. And so I think it would have been really difficult for Robin and Barry to carry on as the Bee Gees, and why they didn't, to a certain extent.
Yeah.
So the loss of Morris was pretty defining for them.
Right. Well, would you, is it fair to say that their main competition when they were really at the height of their careers was the Beach Boys and the Beatles?
Well, competition. I always struggle a little bit with this because we've had lots of conversations about the comparison between especially the Bee Gees and the Beatles, and I think sometimes it's a bit futile to sort of figure out what are the differences between them, who's better, who had more success. I think that the Beatles were also older than the Bee Gees, and so when the Bee Gees were first starting to make records, the Beatles were already popular. And so they looked up to the Beatles, and certainly, if you hear their earlier recordings, through the end of the '60s, and even moving forward, there was some Beatles influence and some of the things they did, much like everybody else who was making music at the time. And so, I think comparing them to the Beach Boys and the Beatles is difficult because I think they came of age in different contexts and at different times as well. The Bee Gees, I think, had really wonderful music that they made throughout their careers, but of course they really found their halcyon, in the late '70s when the Beatles weren't in existence anymore, and the Beach Boys were really under the radar at the time. But I think it's safe to say that they were influenced by both, and you can hear that in some of the records. But I think the Bee Gees, in terms of timeliness, I think when they first started out in the '60s and became internationally famous, I think they were more contemporaries with groups like the Dave Clark Five, the Hollies, and you can hear some similarities in their music as well. But I think if anything, the Beatles and the Beach Boys, were inspiring to the Bee Gees and provided them with some of that initial sort of firepower to make their music. So because they really aspired to be like them.
Okay, I'm going to say something maybe controversial to some of the viewers, but the Bee Gees I had heard of them prior to Saturday Night Fever, but to me, that really introduced me to their sound. Is that fair to say that, I mean, my husband, I said, were you a fan of them before? Had you heard their music? Oh, yeah, I knew the Bee Gees. But for me, the Saturday Night Fever, after that, I started really listening to their music. I think that was that a high point of their career?
I mean, commercially, yeah, it was sort of the apex of their career. And so, I mean, the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack sold and has continued to sell, over 50 million copies worldwide. It's among the top selling soundtracks and among the top selling albums of music history. And so I think their contributions to that soundtrack weren't just commercially successful, they were culture shaping. And so, there's no secret that I think most people recognize those songs, thinking about Staying Alive, How Deep Is Your Love, Night Fever, More Than a Woman, and If I Can't Have You, that they wrote for you with Yvonne Elliman covering it for them. Those were absolutely, where I think their commercial peak, and probably where most people would recognize that. And it's where, they capitalized on that over the years. But I think what I tell people when they listen to their catalog is I said, there would not be a Saturday Night Fever without the music they created in the 1960s. And so listening to their first 3 or 4 albums, for me are really essential listening because you can hear the building blocks, of their music style and all the things that led up to them. And they had a lot of elements of what they were commercially recognized for in the late 70s all the way back then. And you can hear the raw talent that they had. And I think that's important. One of the criticisms I think that folks, like myself and other fans have had is that there hasn't been enough sort of attention paid to what they did after Saturday Night Fever, which was, making great music for themselves, but also writing and producing for really influential artists that they admired throughout their careers. And so thinking about Barbra Streisand, thinking about Diana Ross, Kenny Rogers, Nellie Parton, Dionne Warwick, they made some really career-defining recordings and albums for those artists as well. And so I think that their power was everlasting. And I would argue that you wouldn't have Michael Jackson's Thriller without Saturday Night Fever. You may not have had some of the really essential records of the 80s and 90s without their influence. And so for me, I think that's part of why we wanted to write these books, is to talk about, we certainly write a lot about that important 70s period in the 70s volume, but we really wanted to expand that look at their entire sort of career arc because 70 years worth of music is unique, and not many groups, and I would venture to say not many groups in the future were that everlasting. So,
right. Well, that was an eye-opening aspect of reading this, is how many chart-topping songs they wrote for others, not themselves, that they didn't cover themselves, but others covered. Some of these they did cover. I Started a Joke, Massachusetts, Love You Inside Out, How Can You Mend a Broken Heart, Run to Me, Don't Throw It All Away, Our Love, More Than a Woman, How Deep Is Your Love, which I think that was their #1 chart topper, wasn't it? How Deep Is Your Love?
I think you can go back and forth about which one. From an American chart perspective, Night Fever was actually the song that stayed the longest at the top of the charts. In terms of pure sales and sort of chart influence, How Deep Is Your Love is definitely up there. Staying Alive was, had a lot of had a lot of shelf life, of course, over the years. And so, but How Deep Is Your Love, I think, was probably one of their most significant chart successes that they had almost everywhere. But particularly in the U.S.
That was a beautiful song.
Gorgeous
Then
song.
when they split up, Barbra Streisand famously paired with Barry for Guilty. I think a couple other songs, but mainly Guilty. After the success of the Bee Gees themselves as the group, continuing. Barry, I think, is still continuing to write, and I don't know, is he going to still produce, not just produce, but sing albums anymore, or is he just mainly in the background now? Because they were all always in front of the mic, and on the writing side. So Barry, unfortunately, the oldest, but unfortunately the only one left. What can you tell us about his future from now on? Is he continuing in the business?
Yeah, I think Barry is working on some things right now. He just gave an interview a couple of weeks ago, actually, where he talked about he's going to get a Kennedy Center honor this December. So that's certainly significant, not just for him, but also for the work of his brothers as well. And so with that, he reports that he's been penning a memoir. So that could come to the service. He actually had a really successful album about in 2021 that followed up the Frank Marshall documentary, How Can You Mend a Broken Heart? And so Greenfields was a roots Americana album that reimagined some of the Bee Gees, biggest hits, but also some other ones that weren't necessarily hits. With a lot of roots Americana and country artists that did very, very well. It was a top 15 album in the US and went to #1 in Australia and the UK. So I don't know that he'll record anything else. I mean, he said he's effectively retired. Apparently, he has penned a new song. There's reportedly a biopic that's being produced about the brothers. That's been in the works for several years now. We think it could see light of day in the next couple of years, but we're not terribly sure. So I think he may continue to write. I don't know that he'll tour again. I don't know that he'll make a new album. He's 77 now, and he's been working since he was about 9 or 10 years old. And so I don't want to work until I'm 77. So I don't blame Barry for taking
Well,
time
he has
for
had a
himself.
very, very long and successful career. But let me also actually mention to the viewers, besides the Kennedy Center honors, in 2016, he was knighted by then Prince Charles. So he is Sir Barry.
He is Sir Barry Gibb. He is, and his brothers actually received orders of the British Empire as well. You can't be knighted posthumously, so only he was able to receive that honor. I'm certain if Robin and Morris were still around, they would have been knighted as well. But they've all been recognized in multiple contexts for their contributions to music. But I'm sure that was really special to them as British-born artists to be recognized in that way, and a huge honor for Barry.
That was definitely huge. And I'm going to put you on the spot because we just have a minute left. Can you name your favorite Bee Gees song?
I can't. People have asked me this question many, many times. I can probably do a top 10, but I really love
top 5.
Sure. Okay. I might be able to do that. I love How Deep Is Your Love, Too Much Heaven, You and Again, Spirits Having Flown, and Love You Inside Out are probably up there as my top 5. And I'd probably have to throw Until Love Somebody as number 6 in there. But on any given day, those can sort of change position, depending on how I'm feeling and sort of where my mind and my heart is. I could love those songs as my number 1 on any given day. But that's probably a solid top set of songs that I go back to pretty regularly.
That's great. Okay. Well, I really appreciate you spending time with us today. And I encourage the viewers who are interested in learning about the Bee Gees, their personal lives and their music, because you do delve into their songs, the whole, all of them. It's just amazing. But you've got the two books now. And it was amazing for me. I learned a lot, and I still haven't finished, so I'm going to go back and finish some more. But I play their music now because I am now more familiar with them. So I appreciate all the work you guys have done, and thank you for spending some time with us. And maybe when you come up with something else, we'll get you back.
Thank you. And we are working on the 80s volume right now. And so we're hoping that will come out sometime in late 2024. We're in the process of assembling it and putting it together. So if you'd like to have us back, we would love it. So thank you so much for everything.
So thank you again. My thanks again to Grant. And for the viewers, I will see you next time when we take another look beyond the red carpet. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.
With over 30 years of experience in real estate and the mortgage industry, Darlene Mays provides knowledge and expert guidance to clients looking to buy or sell a home. Serving clients throughout South Orange County, Darlene specializes in the senior community of Laguna Woods Village. Darlene works with her clients to ensure the highest level of service, from the beginning of the process right down to the closing table. If you are looking to buy or sell, who you work with really does matter. Call Darlene Mays today.